The night was cold and quiet along the border. Captain Dae-ho Kim moved through the darkness like a shadow. He had done this mission many times before. Watch the enemy. Report back. Stay hidden. It was simple work for a man who had trained his whole life to be invisible. Dae-ho checked his watch. 3 hours until sunrise. He would be back at base before breakfast. His team was waiting for him 2 miles south. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Then the sky began to glow. At first, Dae-ho thought it was a helicopter, maybe enemy forces doing night training. He stayed low and watched through his scope, but the light was wrong. It was too bright, too blue. It moved in ways that made no sense. The light grew bigger. It was coming down from the clouds. Dae-ho had never seen anything like it. The shape was round and smooth. No wings, no rotors. It made no sound at all. Dae-ho reached for his radio. His team needed to know about this. But when he pressed the button, nothing happened. The radio was dead. His GPS watch had stopped working too. Even his night vision goggles were acting strange. The strange craft landed in a field 50 meters away. Dae-ho could see it clearly now. It was made of metal that seemed to shine with its own light. There were no doors or windows that he could see, just smooth, perfect surface. He should run. Every part of his training told him to get away and report this. But Dae-ho was curious. In 10 years as a Marine, he had never seen technology like this. He wanted to know what it was. A section of the craft opened without making any sound. No door swung out. The metal just disappeared, leaving a dark opening. Light spilled out from inside, and then they came out. They were not human. The creatures were tall and thin. Their skin was gray and smooth like rubber. They had large heads with huge black eyes, no hair, no nose that Dae-ho could see, just a small slit for a mouth. 3 of them walked toward his hiding spot. They moved in a strange way, like they were floating just above the ground. In their hands, they carried devices that looked like weapons. Dae-ho raised his rifle. He had a clear shot at all 3, but something stopped him from pulling the trigger. These were not enemy soldiers. They were something else entirely. Something impossible. One of the creatures pointed its device at Dae-ho's position. A beam of green light shot out. The light touched Dae-ho, and suddenly he could not move. His arms would not work. His legs would not work. He could still see and hear and think, but his body would not obey him. The creatures walked over to where he lay, frozen in the grass. They looked down at him with those big black eyes. One of them made sounds that might have been speech, but Dae-ho could not understand the words. 2 of them grabbed his arms and lifted him up. Even though they looked thin and weak, they were surprisingly strong. They carried him toward their craft like he weighed nothing at all. As they brought him inside, Dae-ho tried to remember everything he saw. The walls inside glowed with soft light. There were panels covered with symbols he did not recognize. The air smelled clean but strange, like the inside of a hospital. They put him on a table in a small room. The walls were white and smooth. There were no windows, no doors that he could see, though he knew there had to be a way out. The creatures stood around the table and looked at him. One of them touched a panel on the wall. Suddenly, Dae-ho could move again. He sat up quickly and looked around the room. "Where am I?" he asked. "What do you want?" The creatures did not answer. They just watched him with those dark eyes. One of them made more of those strange sounds. Another one answered back. Dae-ho stood up from the table. He was still wearing his military gear. His rifle was gone, but he still had his knife and his other equipment. The creatures did not seem worried about this. He walked to where he thought the door should be. The wall looked solid, but when he got close, a section of it disappeared. Just like on the outside of the craft. He could see a hallway beyond. 2 of the creatures moved to block his way. They did not touch him, but they made it clear he should not leave the room. One of them pointed back at the table. Daeho understood. He was a prisoner. He looked around the room again, this time with the eyes of a soldier. The walls were smooth, but not perfect. There were small gaps where panels met. The table was attached to the floor, but the connection looked weak. The light came from the ceiling, but he could see the edges of whatever made it glow. Everything could be used as a weapon if needed. The creatures left him alone in the room. Daeho sat on the table and tried to think. He was clearly on some kind of aircraft, but this was technology far beyond anything humans had built. These creatures were not from Earth. That should have been impossible. But Daeho was a practical man. He believed what he could see and touch. And what he could see was that he had been taken by beings from somewhere else. The question was, what they wanted with him. Hours passed. Daeho tried to sleep but could not. His mind was too active. He walked around the small room and examined every surface. He found tiny differences in the walls that might be controls or sensors. He memorized the location of everything. Finally, one of the creatures came back. This one was different from the others. It wore something that might have been clothing, a long robe made of shiny material. It carried a device that looked more complex than the weapons the others had used. The creature pointed the device at Daeho. Lights flashed on its surface. The creature made sounds that might have been excited. It pointed the device at different parts of Daeho's body. More lights flashed. Daeho realized he was being studied, like an animal in a zoo, or a specimen in a laboratory. The creature left again. Daeho was alone with his thoughts. He thought about his team, waiting for him to return. He thought about his family back home. His sister Yunjin would be worried when she heard he was missing. But most of all, he thought about escape. These creatures had made a mistake. They thought he was helpless because their technology was better than his. They thought he would be easy to control because he was just a human. They were wrong. Daeho had been trained to survive in any situation. He had been trained to escape from any prison. He had been trained to fight against any enemy, no matter how strong or well-armed. These creatures might have advanced technology. They might be smarter than humans in some ways. But they had never fought a Korean Marine. They had never faced someone who had spent his whole life learning how to kill and how to survive. Daeho smiled for the first time since his capture. These aliens thought they had caught a helpless primitive. Instead, they had trapped a predator on their ship. They would learn the difference soon enough. The next morning came without a sunrise. Daeho knew it was morning because his body told him so, but there were no windows in his prison, no way to see outside. The walls still glowed with that soft, strange light. Two creatures entered his room. One was the tall one in robes from the night before. The other was smaller and carried what looked like a medical bag. They both stared at Daeho with those huge black eyes. The tall one made sounds at the smaller one. Then it pointed at Daeho and made more sounds. The smaller creature opened its bag and took out several devices. Daeho backed against the wall. "Stay away from me," he said in a calm voice. He did not shout or show fear. His training had taught him that fear made enemies stronger. The creatures did not understand his words, but they understood his position. The tall one touched something on its robe. Suddenly, Daeho felt very tired. His arms became heavy, his legs felt weak, but he did not fall down. He pressed his back against the wall and stayed standing. The creatures made surprised sounds. The tall one touched its robe again. The feeling of tiredness got stronger. Daeho had felt this before. During training, his instructors had used drugs to make soldiers weak and confused. They wanted to teach the soldiers how to resist interrogation even when they could barely think straight. This was the same thing. These creatures were trying to make him helpless with some kind of drug or ray. But Daeho had trained for this. He knew how to fight through the effects. The smaller creature came closer with its devices. Daeho let it approach. He wanted to see what they would do. Information was more valuable than fighting right now. The creature held up a device that looked like a small mirror. It pointed it at Dae-ho's eyes. Bright light flashed. Then it pointed the device at his chest, his arms, his legs. Each time, the device made soft beeping sounds. Dae-ho stayed still and let them work. But he was not passive. He watched everything they did. He memorized the devices they used and how they worked. He studied their movements and their behavior. The tall creature seemed to be in charge. It gave orders to the smaller one. It made decisions about which devices to use. The smaller one was just following instructions. That was useful information. These creatures had ranks and command structure just like human military units. The tall one was an officer. The small one was enlisted. After an hour of tests, the creatures left. Dae-ho was alone again. The drug effects were wearing off. He could think clearly and move normally. He sat on the table and reviewed what he had learned. These creatures were scientific. They wanted to study him, not hurt him, at least not yet. They had discipline and organization. They followed procedures. That meant they were predictable. Later that day, more creatures came. 3 of them this time. They brought new devices and started different tests. One device made sounds when pointed. At Dae-ho's head, the creature holding it seemed very interested in the sounds. It made excited noises and showed the device to the others. Another device projected images on the wall, pictures of different shapes and colors. The creatures pointed at the pictures, and then at Dae-ho. They seemed to want him to react somehow. Dae-ho understood. They were testing his intelligence. They wanted to see how smart he was. This was his chance to learn about them while they thought they were learning about him. He pretended to be confused by simple pictures. When they showed him a circle, he acted like he did not understand what it was. When they showed him colors, he pointed at the wrong ones. The creatures made sounds that might have been disappointment. They showed him easier pictures, simple lines and dots. Dae-ho continued to act stupid, but while he was acting, he was watching them carefully. He saw how they operated their devices. He noticed that each device had symbols on it, and the same symbols appeared on the wall panels. He began to understand their written language. The creatures spent hours testing him. They tested his reflexes, his strength, his memory. Every test was designed to measure his abilities, and every test taught Dae-ho something new about his captors. He learned that they were physically weak. When one of them accidentally touched his arm, Dae-ho could feel how fragile it was. He could have broken its bones easily. He learned that they relied completely on their technology. They never did anything without using a device. They seemed helpless without their machines. Most importantly, he learned that they thought he was stupid. They talked freely in front of him, not caring that he might understand. And slowly, Dae-ho was beginning to understand their language. It was not like any human language, but it followed patterns. It had rules. By the end of the second day, he could recognize some of their words. Simple ones like yes and no and good and bad. He could tell when they were pleased with test results and when they were disappointed. On the third day, they brought the most complex device yet. It looked like a helmet made of metal and wires. The tall creature put it on. Dae-ho's head before he could resist. Immediately, Dae-ho felt something trying to push into his mind. It was like having someone else's thoughts mixed with his own. Images flashed through his head that were not his memories. The creatures were trying to read his mind. But Dae-ho had trained for this too. In the most advanced resistance courses, instructors had used drugs and hypnosis to simulate mental interrogation. They had taught him how to build walls in his mind, how to hide his real thoughts behind false ones. He let the device see what he wanted it to see. Simple thoughts, basic emotions, the mind of a primitive soldier who only understood fighting and following orders. He hid his real thoughts deep inside, his mind. His plans for escape, his knowledge of their weaknesses, his growing understanding of their language and technology. The creature studied the device's readings for a long time. They seemed puzzled. They tried the device again, but got the same results. Finally, they gave up and took the helmet away. Day-Ho had passed their most important test. They thought his mind was too simple to be dangerous. That night, alone in his cell, Day-Ho allowed himself to smile. These creatures were intelligent, but they had no understanding of deception. They had never dealt with an enemy who could lie to them so completely. They thought they were studying a primitive animal. Instead, they had brought a trained killer onto their ship and given him days to learn their weaknesses. Soon, it would be time to show them their mistake. But not yet. He needed to learn more. He needed to understand their ship and their routines. He needed to find their weapons and their communication systems. Most importantly, he needed them to believe he was harmless until the moment he struck. Day-Ho lay down on the hard table that served as his bed. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more opportunities to learn, more chances to prepare. The creatures thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had become the prey. On the 7th day, Day-Ho decided it was time. He had learned everything he could from watching and waiting. He knew the ship's layout from the sounds he heard through the walls. He knew when the guards changed shifts. He knew which creatures were scientists and which were soldiers. Most importantly, he had figured out how their technology worked. The wall panels responded to touch in specific patterns. The devices they used had simple controls once you understood the symbols. Their weapons were not as complex as they seemed. Everything depended on the same basic power source, and Day-Ho had found that power source's weakness. He had noticed it during the mind-reading test. When the helmet was active, the lights in his cell dimmed slightly. All their technology drew power from the same network. If he could overload one device, it might affect others. The plan was simple. Create a power surge. Use the confusion to escape his cell, get to their weapons, take control of the ship. Simple plans worked best. That morning, the small creature came to his cell as usual. It carried the same scanning device it used every day, the same routine, the same predictable behavior. But today, Day-Ho was ready. When the creature pointed its scanner at him, Day-Ho moved. Not fast enough to seem threatening, just enough to bump into the table and knock over a small piece of equipment. "Sorry," he said, acting clumsy and stupid like always. He picked up the device and handed it back to the creature. But while he was helping, his fingers found the small wire he had loosened over the past 3 days. A tiny connection inside the device that he had been slowly working free. The wire came loose. The device sparked and made a loud noise. The creature dropped it in surprise. Lights flickered throughout the cell. And for just a moment, the wall panel near the door went dark. That was all Day-Ho needed. He lunged toward the door. His hand slapped against the panel in the pattern he had memorized from watching the creatures. The door opened. The small creature turned toward him, finally realizing something was wrong. But Day-Ho was already moving. His hand caught the creature's neck in a grip he had learned in hand-to-hand combat training. The creature was even more fragile than he had thought. Its neck snapped with barely any pressure. It fell to the floor without making a sound. Day-Ho picked up the creature's weapon and scanning device. He had watched them use both items many times. The weapon had a simple trigger mechanism. The scanner could detect other life forms. He stepped into the hallway. The walls here glowed with the same soft light as his cell. There were several doors along each wall, all closed, all identical. The scanner showed 2 more creatures nearby. One was moving toward his position. The other was stationary in a room. Further down the hall, Day-Ho pressed himself against the wall next to his door. When the first creature came around the corner to investigate the noise, Day-Ho was waiting. The alien weapon worked just like he had hoped. A beam of green energy hit the creature and it collapsed, not dead but unconscious. Day-Ho preferred not to kill unless necessary, but he would do whatever it took to escape. He dragged the unconscious creature into his cell and took its equipment. Now he had 2 weapons and better scanning gear. The scanner showed the layout of nearby rooms. Most were empty, but there was a larger space at the end of the hallway that contained several life forms. That was probably where the important creatures were located. Daeho moved carefully down the hallway. His military training had taught him how to move silently even in unfamiliar territory. The soft material of the floor helped muffle his footsteps. He reached the door to the larger room. Through the scanner, he could see 5 creatures inside. They were all focused on something in the center of the room, probably control panels or scientific equipment. None of them were looking toward the door. Daeho took a deep breath and opened the door. The creatures turned toward him in surprise. For a moment, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. 2 of the creatures reached for weapons. Daeho shot them both before they could draw. The energy beams knocked them down instantly. A 3rd creature ran toward what looked like an alarm panel on the wall. Daeho shot it too. It collapsed just short of the panel. The remaining 2 creatures huddled together near the center of the room. They made frightened noises and held up their hands. Universal signs of surrender. Daeho kept his weapon pointed at them while he looked around the room. This was clearly some kind of control center. The walls were covered with panels and screens. Some showed images that might have been maps or star charts. Others displayed symbols and numbers. One screen showed a view of space outside the ship. Daeho could see stars, but no planets. They were not near Earth anymore. That was a problem for later. Right now, he needed to secure the ship. He gestured for the 2 surviving creatures to move against the wall. They obeyed immediately. They were clearly terrified of him. Using hand signals and simple words from their language that he had learned, Daeho made them understand what he wanted. Show him the ship's weapons. Show him the communication systems. Show him how to fly this vessel. The creatures were too frightened to refuse. One of them pointed to different panels and made explanatory sounds. Daeho could not understand all the words, but he could see how the controls worked. The ship's weapons were powerful but simple to operate. Just point and fire. The communication system was more complex, but he thought he could figure it out. The navigation system was the real challenge. The displays showed information he did not recognize: star positions, energy readings, course calculations. It would take time to understand. But he had time now. He was in control. Daeho tied up the 2 surviving creatures using cable from their own equipment. They did not resist. They seemed to accept that he was now in charge. He spent the next few hours exploring the ship. It was larger than he had thought. There were laboratories, storage areas, sleeping quarters, and engine rooms. Most areas were empty, but he found 2 more creatures in the engine section. They surrendered as soon as they saw his weapon. Word was spreading through the ship that the human prisoner had escaped and was dangerous. By evening, Daeho had captured the entire crew, 7 creatures total. Not a large ship, but advanced enough to travel between stars. He locked all the creatures in one of the storage areas. They had food and water. They would be safe as long as they caused no trouble. Then he returned to the control room to figure out his next move. The navigation system showed they were very far from Earth. Too far for him to fly back alone, even if he could learn to operate the ship properly. But the communication system was powerful. It could send messages across long distances. If he could figure out how to use it, he might be able to contact Earth, or he could send a different kind of message. Daeho had been listening to the creatures talk for a week. He understood enough of their language to know they were part of a larger group, an empire that collected specimens from primitive worlds. Earth was not their first target. It would not be their last, unless someone stopped them. Daeho looked at the weapon controls. This ship had enough firepower to destroy a small city. If he could find their home base, he could deliver a message they would never forget. But first, he needed to learn more about their empire, about their military, about their weaknesses. He had all the time in the world to plan, and he had prisoners who could give him information. The creatures thought they had captured a primitive human for their experiments. Instead, they had brought war to their own doorstep. Daiho had been wrong about one thing. The ship was not as empty as he thought. 3 days after taking control, he discovered there were more creatures aboard. They had been hiding in sealed sections of the ship, waiting for their chance to strike back. He found out about them when his prisoners stopped eating. Daiho had been bringing food to the locked storage room twice a day. The creatures always took it eagerly. They were scared of him, but they still needed to eat. But on the 3rd day, they refused the food. They huddled in the corner and made worried sounds when he approached. Something had changed. Something had made them think rescue was coming. Daiho checked the ship's internal sensors. At first, everything looked normal. But then he noticed small power drains in sections he had thought were empty. Someone was using energy in parts of the ship he had not explored. The creatures had backup crew hidden away, and those crew members were planning to take their ship back. This changed everything. Daiho had been planning to interrogate his prisoners slowly, learn about their empire gradually, take his time figuring out how to strike back at them. Now he was in a race. The hidden crew would try to rescue their friends and recapture him. He had to find them first, but this time he would not try to capture them alive. Daiho gathered weapons and equipment from around the ship. The creatures had energy weapons, but they also had tools that could be used as weapons. Cutting devices, restraint equipment, medical instruments. He also found something interesting in their storage areas. Armor designed for hostile environments. It was made for creatures with different body shapes than humans, but he could modify it to fit. Most importantly, he found their security system. The ship had internal sensors in every room. Cameras that could see in normal light and heat signatures. Motion detectors. Atmospheric monitors. Everything needed to track movement throughout the vessel. The system was designed to monitor prisoners and lab specimens. But Daiho could use it to hunt the hidden crew. He activated the sensors and studied the displays. Immediately, he saw what he was looking for. Heat signatures in 3 different sections of the ship, movement patterns that showed conscious, thinking beings. 7 creatures total, spread out across the ship in positions that would let them coordinate an attack. They were not just hiding, they were preparing for war. Daiho smiled. Finally, he was facing enemies who understood what they were dealing with. This would be more interesting than capturing frightened scientists. He studied their positions and movement patterns. They were trying to surround the control room. 2 groups would attack from different directions while a 3rd group rescued the prisoners. It was a good plan. It might have worked against most enemies, but they were fighting a human who had spent years learning how to hunt other humans in urban combat. And this ship was just another kind of city. Daiho turned off the lights throughout the vessel. The creatures relied on artificial illumination. In darkness, they would be nearly blind. But humans had evolved as hunters. His eyes adapted quickly to low light conditions, and he had night vision equipment from his original capture. Now the advantage was his. He left the control room and moved into the ship's maintenance areas, crawl spaces and service tunnels that connected every section. The creatures were too large to use these passages effectively, but Daiho could move through them easily. From inside the walls, he could hear the hidden crew talking to each other. Their voices were tense. The darkness had scared them, but they were still trying to execute their plan. Daiho reached the first group's position, 2 creatures armed with energy weapons. They were standing back to back in a corridor, trying to watch all directions at once. They never thought to look up. Daiho opened a ceiling panel directly above them. He dropped a small device he had built from spare parts. When it hit the floor, it made a bright flash and a loud noise. The creatures spun toward the sound, temporarily blinded. Daiho dropped down behind them and struck with the cutting tool he had taken from their workshop. Both creatures fell without making a sound. Daiho took their weapons and moved on to the next target. The second group had heard the noise and changed their position, but the ship's sensors showed Daiho exactly where they had gone. He circled around through the maintenance tunnels and came at them from an unexpected direction. This time he used their own restraint equipment against them, devices designed to paralyze dangerous specimens. The creatures collapsed before they could raise their weapons. The third group was the largest. 4 creatures moving toward the storage area where their friends were imprisoned. They had given up on stealth and were moving fast, hoping to free the captives before Daiho could stop them. But Daiho was already waiting for them. He had rigged the storage area with traps made from their own equipment. When the first creature opened the door, energy discharged from hidden devices and knocked down the entire group. In less than an hour, Daiho had defeated all 7 of the hidden crew members. Some were dead, others were unconscious. All were out of the fight. The ship was truly his now. But the battle had taught him something important. These creatures were not helpless scientists. Some of them were trained soldiers. They had weapons, tactics, and the courage to fight. If this small research vessel had military crew, what would their warships be like? Daiho spent the next 2 days questioning the surviving prisoners. He had learned enough of their language to ask basic questions, and fear made them willing to answer. The information they gave him was disturbing. The Vorthak Empire controlled dozens of star systems. They had hundreds of ships and thousands of soldiers. They had been collecting specimens from primitive worlds for centuries. Earth was just their latest target. But they had made other mistakes before. Other species had fought back when captured. Some had even damaged Vorthak ships. None had ever escaped to tell about it. The Empire dealt with resistance by destroying entire worlds. If a species proved too dangerous to study safely, they simply eliminated it. Daiho realized that his escape might have doomed his home planet. When this ship failed to return, the Empire might send warships to Earth instead of more research vessels. He had to find a way to protect his world. The ship's navigation system showed the location of several Vorthak bases, military installations, where their fleets gathered, command centers where their leaders made decisions. If Daiho could reach one of those bases, he might be able to do more than just escape. He might be able to send a message that would make the Empire think twice about attacking Earth. But it would be a suicide mission, one human against an entire military base. Even with an advanced ship and powerful weapons, the odds were impossible. Daiho looked at the star charts and began planning his attack anyway. He had not expected to survive his original mission on the Korean border. He had not expected to survive his capture by aliens. He had not expected to escape from their ship, but he was still alive, still fighting, still protecting his world and his people. Maybe the odds were not as impossible as they seemed. After all, the Empire had made one critical mistake already. They had underestimated what humans were capable of. Daiho was about to teach them that mistake could be fatal. The Vorthak military base was exactly what Daiho had expected. Massive, well-defended, completely confident in its own security. That confidence would be their weakness. Daiho had spent 2 weeks planning this attack. He had studied every detail of the base's design from the stolen ship's database. He knew their patrol schedules, their defensive systems, their communication networks. Most importantly, he knew they were not expecting a single human in a captured research vessel to attack their most secure installation. The base orbited a dead planet in the outer reaches of Vorthak space, 12 massive stations connected by transport tubes. Each station housed thousands of soldiers and hundreds of warships. It was the heart of their military power, and Daiho was going to cut out that heart. His approach was simple. The research ship he had captured was still broadcasting its proper identification codes. As far as the base knew, it was returning from a successful mission to Earth. They would let him dock without question. The base's traffic control contacted him when he was still an hour away. The voice spoke in the Vorthak language, asking for mission reports and specimen status. Dae-ho had practiced his response many times. His accent was not perfect, but it was good enough to fool someone who was not listening carefully. "Research complete," he said into the communication device. "Returning with valuable specimens. Request priority docking for immediate analysis." The response was exactly what he had hoped for. "Approved. Proceed to Research Station 7. Science teams will be waiting." Perfect. They were going to gather their best scientists in one location to examine his specimens. That would make his job easier. Dae-ho docked the ship smoothly. Through the viewport, he could see the docking bay was full of creatures waiting to greet him. Scientists, technicians, security guards. At least 50 beings, all eager to see what treasures he had brought from Earth. They had no idea they were about to become the message he was sending to their empire. Dae-ho had spent days preparing for this moment. The ship's cargo holds were packed with explosive devices he had built from the vessel's own power systems. Enough destructive force to take out the entire research station, but that was not his real weapon. His real weapon was the ship's communication array, modified to broadcast on every frequency the Empire used. Military channels, civilian networks, emergency systems. When he activated it, his message would reach every Vorthak in the galaxy. The docking tube connected to his ship. Atmosphere equalized. The creatures outside were making excited sounds, eager to board and examine his cargo. Dae-ho opened the ship's door and stepped out to meet them. The effect was immediate. The creatures closest to the door saw him and froze in shock. A human, walking free, armed with their own weapons. For a moment, nobody moved. Then panic erupted. Some creatures ran for alarm systems, others reached for weapons. A few just stood there, too shocked to react. Dae-ho moved through them like death itself. His weeks aboard their ship had taught him exactly how fragile these beings were. Their advanced technology had made them weak. They had forgotten how to fight with their own hands and bodies. The first creature to reach an alarm panel died before it could activate the system. The second fell with its weapon half-drawn. The third managed to fire one shot that missed completely before Dae-ho's blade found its throat. In less than 5 minutes, the entire welcoming committee was dead. But Dae-ho knew the real battle was just beginning. The base's security systems would have detected the attack by now. Soldiers would be rushing to investigate. The entire station would be placed on alert. He needed to reach the station's central communication hub before they could stop him. Dae-ho ran through the corridors of the research station. The layout was similar to the ship he had captured, just much larger. He followed the signs and symbols he had learned to read, moving toward the center of the complex. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of pursuit, heavy footsteps, shouted orders, the hum of energy weapons charging up. But ahead of him, the corridors were still empty. The creatures who lived and worked here were not soldiers. They were running away from the violence, not toward it. That gave Dae-ho the time he needed. He reached the communication center and blasted through the door. Inside, 3 technicians were frantically trying to send distress signals to the other stations. They looked up in terror as Dae-ho entered. "Please," one of them said in broken human speech. "No, kill us. We surrender." Dae-ho paused. These creatures had learned his language. They had been studying Earth longer than he realized. "How many humans have you taken?" he asked. The technician trembled. "Many, hundreds. From all over your world, for research, for study. Hundreds of his people, stolen from their homes and families, experimented on like animals. Any mercy Dae-ho might have felt disappeared. The technicians died quickly. Then Dae-ho turned to their equipment, the communication. Array was more complex than the one on his ship, but it worked on the same principles. He began connecting the broadcast device he had prepared during his journey here. Outside, the sounds of approaching soldiers were getting louder. They had tracked him to the communication center. Soon they would break through the door he had sealed behind him. But he only needed a few more minutes. The device activated. Every communication channel in the Vorthak Empire was now carrying his signal. Every base, every ship, every government facility would receive his message. Dayho stood in front of the main communication screen and began to speak. "I am Captain Dayho Kim of the human race," he said in perfect Vorthak language. "You made the mistake of thinking we were prey." The words came out clear and strong. Behind him, energy weapons were cutting through the sealed door. Sparks flew as the metal began to give way. "We are not prey," Dayho continued. "We are Earth's apex predators. We have spent millions of years evolving to hunt and kill. We have spent thousands of years perfecting warfare. Every human you take will cost you dearly." The door exploded inward. Vorthak soldiers poured through the opening, weapons raised, but Dayho was not finished with his message. "We do not forgive," he said, turning to face the soldiers. "We do not forget, and we never stop fighting." The soldiers hesitated. They could see the explosive device attached to his chest, the dead man's switch in his hand. If they killed him, the entire research station would be destroyed. "Your empire has made an enemy it cannot defeat," Dayho said, his voice carrying to every corner of Vorthak space. "Leave our world alone. Leave our people alone, or we will bring war to every planet you control." One of the soldiers, braver or more foolish than the others, fired his weapon. The energy beam struck Dayho in the chest. He staggered but did not fall. The device he wore absorbed most of the impact. "We are human," he said with his final breath. "We do not yield." He released the dead man's switch. The explosion was visible from the other stations orbiting the dead planet. Research Station 7 simply vanished in a ball of fire and expanding gas. 12,000 Vorthak scientists, technicians, and soldiers died in an instant. But Dayho's message had already been transmitted across the galaxy. Within hours, reports were flooding into Vorthak High Command. A single human had infiltrated their most secure base, had killed thousands of their people, had broadcast a threat that every citizen of the Empire had heard. The military leaders gathered in emergency session. They reviewed the footage from the research station. They analyzed the humans' tactics and capabilities. What they saw terrified them. The human had not just fought with weapons. He had used psychology, turning their own confidence against them. He had used their technology better than they could. He had shown tactical brilliance that exceeded their own military training. And he had done it all alone. "How many more like him are there?" asked the Supreme Commander. The intelligence reports were grim. Earth had billions of humans. Many were trained soldiers like the one who had destroyed their base. All were descended from predators who had survived millions of years of evolution through violence and cunning. "We classify Earth as a Type 9 extinction threat," the science director recommended. "No further contact, no research missions, complete quarantine." The Supreme Commander agreed immediately. "Send the order to all fleets. Earth is forbidden territory. Any ship that approaches the human system will be destroyed to prevent contamination." But the damage was already done. The human's message had spread beyond official channels. Citizens throughout the Empire had heard his words. They knew that. Somewhere in the galaxy there was a species that could fight back. Other conquered races began to whisper about rebellion. Slave worlds started planning uprisings. The Empire's authority, built on the assumption that they were the strongest species in the galaxy, began to crumble. On Earth, strange signals were detected by radio telescopes around the world, fragments of alien transmissions, evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe. Lieutenant Sung-Min Park of the Korean Marines was investigating reports of unusual activity near the DMZ when he found the crash site. Pieces of advanced technology scattered across a mountainside, and among the wreckage, a set of dog tags belonging to Captain Dayho Kim. The tags were damaged but readable. Along with them was a partially functional alien device that was still broadcasting signals into space.